Welcome everyone to this second week of Socio-Cultural Politics. This week's unit is about population health and diversity with a big focus on equity in the ACT education system. So I'm going to cover two issues here. And there's quite a few extra readings you'll notice down in this section here. So that's not to make you think there's a heap to read. Really only you need to read the issues paper to be able to answer the questions and the history stuff from last week, and a couple of points I'll make in this little talk. Now, this topic, again, I'm going to keep reminding you of this organising principle, that if you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. So I'm going to go through some issues here that raise why that's a concern. The first issue around population health and the issue of diversity is something around language and identity. Okay, so I've got to keep in mind that when we're talking about culture, language, identity, these terms are much debated. They have multiple meanings and mean different things for different people. Now, a number of you who are in the primary cohort, who are doing socio-education, will be quite familiar with that and different interpretations. For others, it's just keeping in mind that your reality is only your reality and other people have different perspectives on that reality. These things change in time, so migrant Australians, Aboriginal Australians, women in Australian society, to pick only a few, their position in society has changed over the last 100, 200 odd years. Now, it's also distributed around space and location and change. So you find in major cities, certain groups tend to live together and in similar regions. But society changes in a socio-historical way as well. The key thing I want to highlight here this week in this set of slides is the notion of ethnicity, gender and class as all interlinked. So while we will look at class in one week and we'll reference gender and ethnicity in issues of diversity, we don't really want to focus on them as separate issues because they're often intersecting. Okay, it's not just that someone happens to be female, middle class, of a migrant background. Okay, and so they're all of those things. They're not one or the other. So it's about how these things interplay that becomes an important aspect. And when we keep in mind the stuff from history and the very recentness of schooling as we know it, mainstream schooling. Okay, so that's what we're talking about really. What does mainstream schooling that everybody does, look like, and how does it incorporate issues of culture, language, and identity? Okay. There is also notions of schooling from the outside. So why do some people choose not to be in mainstream schooling? And the issue of the curriculum and knowledge. Putting those things together, and that's a range of notions, I just want to highlight the complexity of the topic of culture and diversity. What we think is the school system as being good and right, perhaps, may not be good and right for some people. And we know historically that working class kids, to use that description, have not succeeded in school dramatically. We know that kids from parents who are more educated tend to succeed better in education. We know that Aboriginal kids are tended to be marginalised. New migrants are tended to be marginalised. Schooling is operated in a way where we've said, well, this is school, this is good, this is what you should do to become part of our society. That these people are already part of our society. Okay, so it becomes, how do you define what is our society? Okay. Schooling, when we look at the way the curriculum has evolved and developed, evolved from the knowledge that was used by this very small group of people that went on to university and managed public institutions in the early 20th century. As it's evolved, we've all studied the same knowledge, but given the fact that you are in university and you are 1/3 of the graduates who get into university, other 2/3 of children perennially have not achieved a university education experience, even if they should. Who's saying they should? But the notion of, well, schooling works because it gets us into university to then become, say, the teachers in our case, doctors, lawyers, whatever, well, it's still only working for 1/3. And society needs more than that 1/3 to function. I wouldn't be here talking to you if I didn't have my mechanic, who in his expertise in getting my car working, because I haven't got the foggiest idea about that sort of stuff. Okay? And who's to say that the knowledge that a mechanic has is any more or less complex than the knowledge that I or you may have? They're just different. And it takes a whole lot to operate in society. Issues around language are important. Okay, language is culture, so it's really important for groups to maintain their language. We've come to accept that strangely in the last 15, 20 years in relation to Indigenous languages. When I say strangely, it's because we don't tend to accept it with migrant communities. While we tend to have leaflets and pamphlets in multiple languages, people tend to want migrants to speak English most of the time. But maintaining a language tradition, being able to express themselves culturally in language, is important to maintain their identity. Now, words like assimilation are important here. Okay? Assimilation was a policy we had for a while in Australia, both migrants and Indigenous peoples, and that was basically to become like us. Whomever us is. If we could define who the us is, then we'd be doing maybe better. Multiculturalism, as the present policy, is about embracing cultures. Now, when we hear critiques of language, then they're really harking back to issues of assimilation. People say they should be like us. They should speak like us, dress like us, rather than the notion of multiculturalism. And whatever one's view on that might be, we need to keep in mind two things. Australia's been remarkably successful in the world, one of the most successful multicultural societies, and that's just not a political line, it's true. The other thing is we also work in education systems that have policies which value multiculturalism, so we need to make sure that we reflect the policies of the system we work in. The Aboriginal Australian issue, and most of you, or you all would have done the unit with Joe on Aboriginal education perspectives, makes this another tangent. So it's not just about migrants. How do we address this issue when we have the first peoples of this nation? Okay. Issues of language, culture, the right to identity and to expressing identity. And these are really topical matters. I was out of a rural school a couple of months ago, and they got the first kid finishing year 12 in doing Barkindji language. So this is the first time in that school, in that community, an Aboriginal child has been able to study language and get a HSC through doing their own language. So it's pretty awesome. So we're making some progress, but as we know, closing the gap work, not fast enough. The other thing is language as an economic strategy. Australians are the worst at learning languages around the world. Most Australians don't have any knowledge of other languages, whereas a lot of other people in other nations have 3 or 4 languages. So we're pretty poor in that respect, and that's going to hold back our opportunities internationally when we can't compete. If we're going to be working with the growth of China, for instance, we probably should be able to speak some Chinese. So these things can be quite limiting for us. So moving on, there's 2 articles here down the bottom, Viner and Denson and Chang that I mentioned. Now these are pretty dense articles, and they're almost called epidemiology, so public health. Now I've included those because given that they're coming from public health and they're using really large data sets, and people tend to look at health data as being of a better quality than maybe some education data. So I'm using it there to reinforce some of the points that we're making in this unit. That the stuff we're talking about here in the sociology of education is also talked about in epidemiology and public health. So it's not just an educational issue. What we find, using the Viner article for instance, is that it's talking about we need to improve the daily lives of young families. Basically saying that when we improve people's outcomes, we address risk factors, we improve their engagement in schools, then the overall population of the whole community rises. But he does point out in that article, with the large data tables and everything else, that there are large numbers of children in the community who are living in very poor conditions, but whose life opportunities are limited by the conditions that they're living in. So he's highlighting the relationship between poor health and lack of what we call agency, the ability to make decisions and control one's life course. So he's showing through this very large data that these things are real, and they've continued over generations, and that the health and education background of the family has a significant impact on the health and education futures of those children. So it's quite a significant and important study. It gets away from the old, oh look, I know a plumber who earns $1 million a year, so all you've got to do is work harder. It's like, well, there might be 1 or 2 plumbers that do that, but for every one, there's about 20 or 30 that don't. So we've got to get away from the exceptions. We can all point to the odd exception and say that's what people should do, just work harder and be more like them. But things like the Viner article and data that we will use clearly shows that exceptions are just that. They're exceptions. On a population level, it doesn't actually work that way. And these relationships between a parent's educational background, health, etc., are real and are perennial problems. We need to be mindful of exceptions. Denson and Chang article comes from America, looking at some college students and the issue of engaging with racial diversity through knowledge and discussing knowledge and engaging with knowledge issues. What they actually show is that in the classes where students engage with cross-cultural, intercultural discussion on those campuses, students from all backgrounds performed better. So it's not just a case of recognising culture, so the students from that culture you're recognising improve their educational outcomes. It was actually a case of all cultures improve their educational outcomes. So the notion there is that engagement with diversity is good for everyone. Now, if we just look at the standards for a moment, I just want to reinforce that standard 1, no students and how they learn. This first bit, no students, is part of where we're at. Okay, and know the content and how to teach it is where we're at. So knowing students is not just knowing them in their psychological sense as beings that develop and have cognitive development. It's about knowing them in their social, cultural, religious, socioeconomic background, etc. And you'll see those things referenced in the standards. And it's the same with how to teach it. The standards, their references, knowing their cultural, socioeconomic background, language groups, etc. Okay, and Indigenous knowledges, etc. come in with this as well. So we need to recognise that the standards aren't just about generic person, they actually recognise difference and diversity. It's interesting because when we have good old John Hattie, and probably all familiar with John Hattie to some respect, and his argument here that he made back in 2003, that, we can't control the students, was his argument, because they come to school with 50% of the variance of achievement. But teachers, they are the largest in-school factor that we can control. They're 30% of the variance. And from John Hattie, we've got AITSL standards, we've got pedagogy models, etc. Basically all using public policy to try to improve this 30%. Because the argument being, we can't control what's on the outside. Well, that's a bit difficult, because if we go back to Viner and others, that's actually where most of the influence in educational achievement really comes from. So if we can engage in whole of community strategies to improve the life opportunities of youth, then we're likely to have a better impact on education. Or we're not likely to, we will. And there's ample studies that point that out. Bad choice of words. Important thing with Hattie in his book, this Visible Learning that most principals have on their desk, or the next version, is that he actually makes it really clear. Okay? Critical discussions around class poverty, resources, health in families and nutrition are not included. But it's not because they're unimportant. Indeed, they may be more important than many of the influences discussed in the book. Right. So even Hattie himself is making the argument and trying to avoid that issue around, hey look, why are we doing this? We should be focusing on teachers. Like, well, actually, no, that's just not what he's looking at. Now, importantly, he talks about some influential stuff, which are what we call effect sizes and statistics. Okay, so he shows how certain interventions in school and certain approaches to schooling increase achievement in basic skills, so things like NAPLAN. Okay, now one critique is we don't actually know how that relates to higher order skills, but there's an expectation that if they're increasing NAPLAN results, then that's also meaning an increase in higher order skills. We can't guarantee that. That's just an assumption that he's making. Important thing to keep in mind is this effect size of 0.4. Right? So if something is getting 0.4 effect, it's basically just the effect of going to school. So if you turn up to school, you're likely to have an impact on your learning. So things above 0.4 are more than just turning up. So things that are surprisingly low in his study are things like doing extra classes, so summer school, catch-up classes. Class size doesn't turn up very high. Okay? There's reasons for that. We'll talk about that in class another time. Things like teaching test taking, so teaching kids how to do that plan, etc., how to do the senior exams. They don't really have much effect. Okay. They all have some, but they're actually below the general effect of schooling. Okay. Students rating teacher quality, so student feedback like your USS that we have here is only just 0.44. That's no major effect on your learning. Things that make a massive effect though are self-reported grades. So that's when students assess themselves and their grades and how they think they're performing. When students talk and how they're that's not just how they're learning, it's how they understand their learning and what they need to do to improve their learning. Peer programs, which are basically making sure that things are developmental. So you're not teaching things above the developmental level of the child. It's all progressive, so you build on previous year's knowledge. And things like formative evaluations, where students are, again, looking at their strengths and weaknesses in understanding a topic, what they need to do to improve, etc. So they're really all of things that make a big difference. Now, okay, so that's just formative evaluation, which is systematically investigating the effects of teaching on an intervention. So it's just about working with students to go, well, where are you at? What are you weak at? What do you need to improve at? How can we improve it with you? And students being actively involved in managing their own learning. So what it means though for us as teachers is that we can help students improve their self-expectations. We can understand what students can do or should be doing at different ages of their developmental spectrum. And we can develop strong and robust ways to evaluate and understand our teaching with students. Why am I telling you that in this particular Why am I telling you that in this particular unit? Because students' self-esteem, okay, and their expectations on what they can do, and understanding and evaluating their own performance are all mediated by culture and by language and by previous expectations. So students whose parents don't have the same education as some others don't understand how school works. They've learned very early that they're actually not a good fit for school. School doesn't look like them or work for them. So they develop a system of lowering their own expectations. So we need to improve that. Okay. We can only do that if we understand why it's happening. Okay. We need to understand why students are lowering their expectations and what the impact of their social cultural context is, lowering those expectations when they don't fit. When we do that sort of stuff and we work with kids to develop strong understandings to help evaluate teaching, which is not just you're a good teacher or not. It's like, no, I'm not learning this subject. I need you to help me learn this subject because I don't understand these concepts. Those concepts are generally concepts that are culturally biased, that we don't recognise might be culturally biased. An example, I had my daughter had a new teacher in her Year 6 class a couple of years ago, and the teacher had come from a school in Sydney, at a Vantage School, and we live in a very mixed community where we live, out of Canberra here, and the teacher just wanted to know how they could write. So I said, asked the kids on the very first day, right kids, I want to see how you can write. Can you just write an end to Cinderella for me so I can assess your writing skills? Now, that was alright because my background, my daughter understands Cinderella and can write. Half the class didn't even know what Cinderella was. So there was an assumption that all children know fairy tales and know how to read them. But you can't make that assumption. It depends on the family, cultural context that kids come from. So there's a little assumption that was made that basically meant half the class couldn't do the task. So we need to be mindful of such assumptions. There's just some things there that are other strategies and examples that you might want to note, but not of any great effect. Now, these next slides are not too concerning, so I'm just going to whiz through them. Basically, things that we know is that a student with a high-performing teacher basically improves dramatically from a middle point. Student with a low-performing teacher drops. So, yes, how do you stop our teacher quality? It does matter. The thing that makes teachers high performing, though, is that they work with the background of the children. Okay? In most of Hattie's studies, these teachers here, they're working with the backgrounds of students and differentiating learning for students. Then down here, just a little few things to understand around the notion of ICSEA. So you've all seen ICSEA on the My School's website. This is just the slides from the technical paper, which you can have a look at on the My School site. There, just to show these are the things that we know affect student achievement. Okay, so the educational variables of the parents, the occupational variables of the parents, and education degrees, etc., that are all interlinked. Then things like optimal wage and income. So these are all weighted, and these are the sort of weightings here. So we know that professional parents have a higher impact on their children's educational outcomes. People with less school education have a lower impact. Indigenous has a correlation with poorer educational achievement. Rurality has a small relationship, and disadvantaged language background students has a relationship. So the thing about ICSEA is that ICSEA is a predictive measure. It doesn't just talk about the socioeconomic background, but behind it, it gives a snapshot of what informs that number, which are breakdowns of things like occupation, education, etc. So this is, again, more evidence that even the very nature of My School's education system in which we work recognises, in the way it categorises schools, that the families that children come from have an impact on educational advantage and disadvantage. Okay. So ICSEA even stands for Index of School and Community Educational Advantage. Okay. So it's a measure of advantage. I just want to move now quickly on to a couple of points about the ACT. The ACT, we often get these nice headlines about how good we are in literacy and numeracy, etc. The ACT is a strange jurisdiction. Basically, we have some of the most advantaged areas, the most advantaged communities in the nation. There's actually no statistical area in the ACT that is below the national average of advantage and disadvantage. None of the ACT schools are disadvantaged. Even the ones that you'll think of as disadvantaged ACT schools, when you look at their ICSEA numbers, they're not massively below the national average of 1,000. Okay? And they actually don't get anywhere near the national definition of a disadvantaged school, which is an ICSEA of 800. Okay? They just happen to be disadvantaged for the Canberra context. And we need to keep in mind that half of you won't work in Canberra in 10 years' time. So what is understood as advantage and disadvantage here is a different beast. We need to think critically about that. But things to keep in mind, importantly, are that the ACT actually has, while it has some of the most socially advantaged students, you can see there that ACT kids, socially advantaged, are right over compared to everyone else. Okay. It also has some of the most socially advantaged schools, so they're right over here. So we want to recognise that the schools we're working in are actually not typical of the nation. But it also has some NAPLAN results that are pretty stark. So these are the same kids. You did NAPLAN year 5, 7 and 9, so the same students. And what I'm pointing out here in this graph, at national minimum standard at 9 and above, is that the ordering remains the same. If you happen to have parents with a bachelor's degree, okay, then you stayed leading in all of these measures. So schooling didn't actually change where you were. Okay, so schooling did not have an impact on the order of your learning with your NAPLAN results, given the background of your parents' education. So we're not actually changing the life course of children. We use this longitudinal data. Same with Indigenous kids. Currently, again, Indigenous kids in NAPLAN here, they're at the national minimum standard, but they're not getting higher grade bands. Okay, so it's a non-Indigenous in red there, whereas 9 or above, they're all way up there, whereas just the minimum standard, the Aboriginal kids are getting that. The ACT is actually then a jurisdiction where Aboriginal kids go backwards between primary and high school in NAPLAN results. Same graphs in a different form, but you can see here, years 3, when we had the group of students at year 3, same kids in year 5, same kids in year 7, same kids in year 9, that parents with a bachelor's degree, they're at the top and they're staying at the top. These are the lines, okay, so the year 12 line, kids whose parents had year 12, or kids whose parents had year 11, are not actually changing. They're still the gaps that exist between each data point. Same with Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids. That gap isn't changing. So that's something we need to be mindful of. We might talk about ACT going well, but there's some things hidden in there that we need to work on. Even when we look here, there's this issue of segregation going on. So year 3 reading. Okay, kids, year 3 reading is largely influenced by parental background. C is Catholic, G is government, I is independent. You can see even at year 3, the kids at independent schools with a school ICSEA at the top end are performing higher in NAPLAN than kids in, say, government schools and Catholic schools. So there's a social ordering going on even in year 3. And you can see there's a relationship there between school ICSEA and reading scores. So that nice line shows that those two things are related. And you can see that line doesn't change when we get to year 9. So again, independent schools in year 9 getting higher NAPLAN scores in reading compared to the other schools. Okay, but note here, that's the national average of 1,000. Okay, there's a couple of schools here that are just below 1,000, but they're nothing near what we would nationally say are disadvantaged schools. The other thing using PISA data is, actually if we look at PISA data here for 2009, the ACT actually is the most inequitable system. So it's pointing out that the relationship between this proxy for SES used in PISA, so there's a sharper relationship between parental background and performance in reading literacy than, say, in South Australia. So things we need to be mindful of. We might not have a huge number of disadvantaged students in our schools, but they are actually performing worse than they might elsewhere, and that's a real problem. These last graphs I won't focus on, they're just more or the same data, just showing you the same point that things aren't changing. Okay, so here we've got a really long tail, as we call it. Okay, so the bottom end of ACT achievement in PISA is actually lower than everywhere else other than Tasmania and Northern Territory. Okay, so that's not what we won't be wanting. You can see it's actually below the Australian average there. So some of these stories about how good we are is great, but if you're disadvantaged child in the ACT, it's not all that great. Now, I would encourage you to have a quick look at a couple of these things: performance in ACT schools and ACT not leading the nation report. These are from very recent research, which show that issues around social segregation in schools, students from social backgrounds congregating in certain schools in the ACT versus others, is becoming an issue of social separation. So even in the ACT with peculiar equity background and equity makeup, we have this significant issue happening of a form of social segregation, which has an impact on teaching and learning. And we'll look at that when we move on to notions of class. Now, I have gone more than a 10-minute little snippet. I've gone for 28 minutes, so